2 Kings 17. This is the Assyrian invasion of Israel. The first 6 verses, you get a description of what happens. You have King Hoshea becomes king. He is described as not a good king, but not necessarily as bad as the other kings. And he broke an agreement with the king of Assyria. The king of Assyria comes in and invades Israel, carries people away, destroys Israel essentially. And then in verses 7 through 23, you get a description of why that happened. It happened because God is punishing Israel, not because of some sort of bad political agreement that the king made, because God is punishing Israel for their centuries of disobedience to him. They were told when they came out of the Exodus to be different from the other nations, to not worship the same gods that the other nations did, and they did all of the things that God told them not to do. They made idols, they made golden calves, they practiced divination, they made their children pass through the fire, they bowed down to the stars, they worshiped the Baals. They did all the things that God said for them not to do. So God was very angry with them, and he punished them with this. And that's what this punishment is. And he had Assyria come in and take them out of the land. And then in verses 24 through 41, you see that the king of Assyria brought in foreign people and put them in the land. And then those people were punished by God because they didn't worship him properly. The king of Assyria was told that they needed to worship God properly, the God of that land. And so he sent a priest who taught them how to worship God, but they added the proper worship of God, but still practiced the other things. So essentially what has happened here is the nation of Israel is just sort of blended in with the rest of the world. They're not different anymore. They're not God's chosen people necessarily. They're like every other nation at this point. So this is what is referred to as the exile. This is Israel's exile. Judah's exile will come later, but they're headed to that as well. This is a monumental event in the Old Testament. All of the prophets are referring to this. They all are either describing what's leading up to it, they're describing it happening, or they're describing the aftermath of it. So it is a huge event, and it even carries over on into the time of Jesus. By that time, Israel was sort of out of exile in that they were back in the land. They had rebuilt the temple. They had a king again, but they were still ruled by a foreign nation. So many people during that time would have considered themselves still in exile, even under Jesus' time. So for us to learn from this, I think the first thing we can see is that God does not tolerate sin. Like, he will not tolerate sin, even if it looks like he is. For a long time, we should never mistake God's holding back judgment as an endorsement of sin. He let the nation of Israel go through huge periods of time, sinning against him, rebelling against him, and he was always paying attention then. He was always watching, always waiting for them, giving them opportunities to turn back to him, but they didn't. So he punished them, and the punishment he brought them was very severe. Like, they were, essentially, this is a death sentence for the nation of Israel. They're no longer his special people. He doesn't dwell with them in the same way. The temple is gone. The relationship that he had with his people is severed and destroyed, essentially, at that point. So where do we see salvation in this? Salvation does come, in a sense, when they come back out of the exile, when we get to the New Testament period where they are back in the land. They have the temple again. They have a king. But as I said, they're not really out of exile in their own minds. And when Jesus comes, the expectation that a lot of people had for him is that he would lead them out of this exile, that he would overthrow the foreign leaders and set Israel back up like they were with David and Solomon as kings when Israel was an independent, powerful nation. That's what people wanted from Jesus. But what Jesus came to do was to bring them back out of the original exile that occurred at Eden when Adam and Eve rebelled against God and they were cast out and they had their relationship with God severed. Jesus came to mend that relationship, not to set them up, not to reestablish Israel as this powerful nation, but to bridge and retake and remake that relationship that humanity had as individuals with God. And so that's what he came to do. And the salvation that we have through Jesus restores that original relationship and fixes that original exile that humanity has against God. So when we look at 2 Kings 17, we see God's terrible judgment, but even within that, there is always an element of salvation, that God does preserve a remnant, that he is preparing the way for Jesus to come and to bring people out of that original exile. And so we, as New Testament believers, we don't have to live under that terrible wrath of God in exile. We instead get to live under the gracious salvation that we have in Jesus.